He who wields the dagger never wears the crown. That is what is said about Michael Heseltine. It's an adage intended to explain that those who backstab the Prime Minister almost never prosper. However, to the contrary, most who do this usually end up in such position. And this goes back decades, and history suggests that British politics is rife with these opportunities to backstab the Prime Minister. I suppose when discussing modern British politics, at least of the post-war period, it doesn't get bigger than Margaret Thatcher herself. Her downfall is a fascinating area to look into. And we should begin with Thatcher's Deputy Prime Minister, Geoffrey Howe, who in 1990 resigned and delivered a scathing speech which ultimately proved fatal for Thatcher. He was a loyal soldier through the years from the 80s, but finally had enough and resigned. He got up in the House of Commons and let it rip. And from his now legendary speech, one of the most remembered lines is about a popular sport you may have heard of, that of cricket. He used the analogy of a batsman batting against his own team. This was a line which ultimately destroyed Thatcher, not because he was perceived as clever, but because he came from within her own cabinet. And this is a common pattern that you can see from British politics. The real damage always comes internally rather than from the external opposition. And that is what our critics sometimes miss. By 1990, Thatcher just was not the same woman she was when she won the thing in 1979. She was erratic, using the royal we, and appeared exhausted at times, producing unpopular, useless policies as well, like the poll tax, which was also unpopular. Her own MPs were terrified of losing their seats as they viewed Thatcher as an increasing liability. Ever the self-preserving types, the Conservatives would eventually turn on her. And when challenging the leadership election, she won the initial round, but not enough to prevent a second round from occurring, and therefore she would tender her resignation, a slow betrayal which was also carefully planned. It looked honourable on the surface, but ultimately it destroyed the party by eroding trust, as people by 1997 did not trust the successive Conservative cabinets. The real tragedy here as well is that the man who presented this challenge to Thatcher, Michael Heseltine, nicknamed Tarzan, had wielded the dagger but never became Prime Minister. Hence the phrase Heseltine wielding the dagger but never wearing the crown, as that ultimately went to John Major instead. It was in essence a way to save grace for the legacy of Heseltine, but as we can see in later examples as well as previous, this isn't a correct assertion to make. Now, jumping on to a more recent case would be Johnson versus May in 2019. It was the same playbook but offered a different outcome. Johnson was May's foreign secretary, but he had been leaking against the cabinet for months. He was a right pain in the press. Every time May tried to do something on Brexit, playing a balancing act between the Leavers and Remainers herself, a firm believer in the European Union, Johnson was there with an anonymous quote saying she was wrong. He was coy and very sly about it, operating in the darkness and the secrets. Which is important, as he would never open a direct and open challenge to her, opting instead to do things behind the scenes. And it's something that I've always found to be quite sinister about Boris, is the fact that he's quite unassuming in how he behaves. In July 2018, Johnson resigned and would pen a letter full of big words about practicing principle, something from a man who'd never practiced principle a day in his life. Well, perhaps when he was at Peppa Pig World. He would then confine himself to the backbenches and vote against the government again and again, waiting for the opportune moment to arise, allowing May to simply slowly bleed out. May would survive a vote of no confidence in December 2018, but she was damaged by this as she was already governing on a hung parliament coming from the summer election of 2017. And so she would have to save face by resigning 6 months later, as the position was simply untenable. And this is where Johnson would be able to stand for her leadership and win, wearing the crown for 3 years and until his own failures and incompetencies caught up with him in 2022. But that's a topic for another video entirely. The key difference to take away, I suppose, is in terms of how the challenge was presented. Heseltine did it in a public and open manner. Johnson didn't do something similar to this. He resigned, voted against May, but he never outwardly announced his intention to go for the job. In fact, he is quoted as once saying, prior to all the hullabaloo about being a politician, "There's more chance of me being reincarnated as an olive, or dining with Elvis on Mars." Another prominent example would be Thatcher versus Heath coming in 1975. In 1975, what people tend to forget is that Thatcher's origins came from an ousting of the previous leader, Ted Heath. Heath, as the leader of the Tories, had lost 2 elections in the same year, in 1974, The party would be desperate, and Thatcher herself, not a big beast or anything, she didn't have a flashy elite role. She was just the education secretary. On a side note, that is also where her reputation as the milk snatcher comes from. In 1971, she took away free school milk for kids aged 7 to 11, affecting many children around the country. If you don't believe me, just ask anyone you know who grew up in that time period. She was, in that regard, a really horrible woman. But here's where the clever part comes in. The team ran a campaign based on stealth. It wasn't loudly announced, they just did things in secret, quietly, challenging Heath and winning, going on to wear the crown for the next decade, becoming as well the longest serving Prime Minister of the 20th century, one of the most famous, notorious, and well recognized politicians of the post war period. She got there by wielding a dagger against her own leader. So much for never wearing the crown, Tarzan. Thatcher proved a quiet, well-timed stab could put you on top for the next 11 years. But not every backstab is so clean, which brings us to a much messier one. A partnership that started with a secret dinner and ended with two men who could barely look at each other, Blair and Brown. Now on to Blair and Brown, and this is what I would call a sad case. A brilliant pairing, but one that seemed always destined and doomed to fail. Brown wanted to be Prime Minister from the moment Labour won in 1997. He had his eyes set on the role, and as per their agreement made at the Granita restaurant in 1994, he was to be President, Prime Minister by the mid 2000s after Blair had gone for two terms. He would continue to undermine Blair when it appeared unlikely Blair would honour this agreement, as Blair ran for a third term in 2005. With briefings, leaks, private grumblings, and the relationship even breaking down and deteriorating to the point where the two former besties, could not even communicate anymore. He attempted a coup in 2006, and this failed, but he kept pushing and trying, and eventually Blair just had to go, resigning in 2007. And Brown would become Prime Minister in the same year, and what would follow was three turbulent but very brilliant years. He saved the world, don't you know, with the famous bank bailout in 2008. He did eventually receive the crown, it just took a long time to do so. And there you have it, multiple cases of this scenario playing out, all wielding the dagger and all wearing the crown. Well, to be fair, they are all clowns wearing crowns, one could say. But the Heseltine rule is ultimately wrong, or at least incomplete, as proven by the cases of Thatcher, Johnson, and Brown. However, to be perfectly frank, the real rule, it should be said, is not about whether one wields a dagger, but whether the public perception is on you as the assassin. Heseltine was always viewed as the man who killed the golden goose, which was Margaret Thatcher. Even while she was viewed as erratic, she was still a legend within the party for what she did in the 1980s, in 1983, 1987, as well as 1979, it should be also mentioned. The party just couldn't reward him for backstabbing the leader. He was too closely linked with the brother Thatcher. On the other hand, Thatcher wasn't seen as an assassin against Heath, but a fresh start, challenging the same man who lost two elections, as well as messed everything up in the 1970s with his four-year premiership in the early 70s, which was horrible, and Thatcher would be seen as the same vehicle for change, more committed to bringing back what made the Conservative Party so great. And May's cabinet as well was already falling apart. Brexit had killed her, and the party knew she was bound for failure. Remaining in charge of taking the UK out of the EU, it never made sense, and Johnson was seen as the best man for the job after the political leadership battle. He really wasn't, but that was the logic or lack thereof of the party at that moment in time. And Brown was viewed as a schemer, but I mean, I think he's completely gone wrong, you know. He was a very good prime minister, and people, I guess, slate him for the wrong reasons. You know, he did what he could in that brief period of time, and ultimately, the people didn't decide to reward him when they should have. And had they voted for him, we wouldn't have had 14 years of conservative mediocrity from 2010 to 2024. We really messed up not electing Gordon Brown and perhaps a Lib Dem coalition. Then again, Nick Clegg couldn't do anything right, could he? He was also bloody. There are things I want to say about Nick Clegg. Not many of them are positive. Well, I digress. Really, it's more about doing things quietly rather than loudly. And the lesson across all these cases is that the timing and perception matter more than the act of backstabbing itself. You should never strike too openly, unless you risk becoming the villain. striking from the shadows or after the leader's already dying, and you can make his case as the heir and become the next prime minister. And so, to wrap up and conclude what has been a long amount of rambling, the old adage proves to be half right and half wrong, as adages commonly are. It's not completely true, not wholly accurate, but he who wields a dagger can certainly and most definitely wear the crown. Thatcher did so, as did Johnson, and Brown as well. Heseltine being the exception, not the rule, and he lost out simply because he was just too loud about the way he did things. The realm of British politics is not a place to openly declare war, rather it should be seen as a setting which rewards patience. The quiet letters sent to the Conservative Party's 1922 committee, resignations that look principled in nature but are actually deep betrayals, subtle backstabbings. The real job is to wait until the leader is stumbling and the boat has been rocked. Only then will offering yourself as a steady alternative to calm the waves be a suitable avenue of seizing political power. Ultimately, that is a real playbook, as shown by all these Thatcher, Brown, all those successful and sure Heseltine provided us with a great quote to remember him by, but he never quite got the top job he felt he may have deserved. And that is the difference between remaining a historical footnote and becoming the Prime Minister himself and etching your name in the annals of history. So if you ever find yourself standing behind a struggling leader, just remember always to be quiet, be patient, and for goodness gracious sake, do not let anyone see you smile. And thanks for watching. See you next time. Make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And let me know your thoughts down below. Have a great rest of your day, and I hope you enjoyed this video.